Second, to reinforce the competitiveness of Canadian businesses. And thirdly, to build the strongest economy in the G7.
Today, we will witness one of the most dramatic economic dramas of the 21st century. This is a story about how one decision, made in Washington for the sake of election slogans, turned into a strategic defeat for an entire country. A decision that, in a matter of weeks, destroyed a decades-old trading system, jeopardized hundreds of thousands of jobs, and turned a symbol of American leadership into a monument to its defeat. We are not talking about a lost war or a terrorist attack. It was a much quieter, but no less destructive weapon: tariffs.
The objectives of Canada's new government have been constant. First, to protect Canadian workers and their families.
When Donald Trump hit the send button on social media and announced 25% tariffs on cars and parts from Canada and Mexico, he was sure he was showing strength. But at that moment, he started a chain reaction that's still growing today. Before your very eyes, America lost what it considered unshakable: its economic advantage over its neighbors.
Throughout our negotiations with the United States on a new trade and security relationship,
Across the ocean, this news was met with applause, but Ottawa was closest to the action. It was there that former Bank of England Governor Mark Carney launched an operation that would later be called the most precise economic strike of the 21st century. While the White House was immersed in America First rhetoric, Canada was quietly preparing moves that would change the rules of the game.
our negotiations with the United States have been taking place as the U.S. has been in the process of fundamentally transforming all of its trading relationships.
The Gordie Howe Bridge, in which more than $5 billion had been invested, was supposed to be the crown jewel of American influence, an artery connecting the continent and proving that Washington dictates the terms. But instead of a symbol of power, it became a tombstone for trust in the United States. Thousands of trucks, millions of parts, the entire automotive assembly line, all of this became hostage to a single tweet.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
Canada's response was cool-headed and technological. For the first time in history, the new dynamic tariff system made it possible to respond to Washington's actions instantly, without parliamentary debates or diplomatic pauses. American companies had not yet had time to calculate the damage, and Canadian regulations were already rewriting their business models. For dozens of factories in Detroit and Ohio, this was a death sentence. But it didn't stop at cars. In a matter of months, Canada began to reshape its own economy. From the hydrogen corridor to new trade agreements with Europe and Asia, it all created the impression that, for the first time in decades, Canada's northern neighbor was embarking on a path of independence. And the louder Trump promised to restore greatness, the faster the supply chains on which millions of Americans depended collapsed. Today, the debate is not about the price of steel or lobsters. It is about something much bigger: whether America can maintain its leadership if its allies no longer believe in its strength. The bridge that was supposed to unite now divides, and every day that fewer cars than planned cross it, it serves as a reminder that greatness can be lost in an instant.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
This is not just a story about tariffs. It is a story about pride, betrayal, and the birth of a new reality where allies become rivals. And if you think the conflict is over, you are mistaken. It is only just beginning. When Donald Trump signed an order in early 2025 imposing 25% tariffs on auto parts from Canada and Mexico, the White House presented the event as another victory in the field of economic nationalism. His speech was filled with familiar phrases: America first, only American steel, jobs will come back home. At rallies, thousands of supporters chanted slogans, unaware that at that very moment, the largest arterial project of North American integration, the Gordie Howe International Bridge, had become a symbol of the opposite effect. What was supposed to be the crowning achievement of Trump's legacy and proof of American dominance turned into a financial trap and diplomatic defeat in a matter of weeks. From the outset, it was clear that the tariffs would affect not only finished cars, but also every small part, without which manufacturing in the US simply cannot function. Engine blocks assembled in Michigan were shipped to Ohio, then sent to Ontario for final assembly and returned to the United States. This system, honed over decades, brought in billions of dollars in profits and ensured the smooth operation of more than 200 businesses on both sides of the border. But on the night the tariffs took effect, the cost of parts jumped 3 or even 4 times. On the same day, Detroit factories began cutting shifts. According to official union data, about 8,000 jobs were lost in the first week. In reality, the figure was higher. Independent researchers pointed to 12,000 layoffs in Michigan alone.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
The Gordie Howe Bridge was of particular importance. Built as a $5 billion project, it was supposed to handle up to 12,000 trucks per day and ensure a daily turnover of more than $400 million in goods. In Trump's office, this bridge was called the Steel Heart of America. But instead of a heart, it became a tomb. Just 1 month after the tariffs were introduced, freight traffic fell by a third. Transport companies preferred the old Ambassador Bridge, where the rules and tariffs remained transparent, albeit less profitable. Articles began to appear in the press with headlines such as a $5 billion failure and the bridge that leads nowhere. In Washington, however, they tried to ignore the disaster. Officials spoke of temporary difficulties and accused Canada of sabotage. But in Ottawa itself, the situation was viewed differently. Former Bank of England Governor Mark Carney, who had already entered politics at that point, saw Trump's decision not as a mistake, but as a gift. Canada had been in the shadow of the American economy for decades, but now there was an opportunity to move ahead, and Carney seized it without delay. Trump and his team claimed that the tariffs would strengthen the US domestic market, but in reality they were destroying entire industries. Factories in Ohio reported downtime due to a lack of parts, logistics companies lost contracts, and farmers in Iowa and Nebraska, unable to access the Canadian market, began to face oversupply and falling prices. Against this backdrop, the administration continued to talk about a victory for the American working class.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
And yet the real drama unfolded around symbolism. The Gordie Howe Bridge was conceived as the greatest symbol of US-Canadian cooperation since World War II. It was supposed to replace the outdated Ambassador Bridge and show that the future of trade was in the hands of the US. At the groundbreaking ceremony, Trump gave a speech about eternal friendship, but 2 years later, it was his own decision that turned the bridge into a monument to division. Canadian newspapers published cartoons, a bridge leading into nowhere, Trump sawing through a steel span, or the inscription "Bridge to Nowhere." The American side tried to hide the extent of the damage. The Department of Commerce released a report claiming that the decline in freight traffic was only 5%. But data from independent transport agencies told a different story: a 33% drop in the first 2 months and a trend toward further decline. During some night shifts, no more than 4,000 trucks crossed the bridge, a figure at which the project became unprofitable.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
It was then that the expert community coined the phrase, "The bridge that was supposed to unite now divides." Conferences in Toronto and Montreal discussed not only the economic consequences, but also the issue of trust. For the first time in decades, Canada felt that Washington was capable of overturning agreements overnight for the sake of domestic politics. The American press also gradually changed its tone. While newspapers such as the Wall Street Journal and the New York Post initially expressed support for the tariffs, By the spring of 2025, the headlines had become much bleaker. Trump lost the chess game to Canada, or the price of one tweet billions of dollars in losses. Cable channels began to run stories about working families who had lost their income and empty warehouses in Detroit.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
But even more devastating was what happened in the symbolic realm. For Americans, the Gordie Howe Bridge was a project of pride, an example of how infrastructure strengthens the state. For Canadians, it became a symbol of betrayal. A lasting association formed in public opinion. The US could no longer be trusted as a partner. Political scientists noted a rise in anti-isolationist sentiment, and Washington's trust rating in Canada fell from 62% to 28% in just 6 months. Thus, the tariffs were not just an economic decision. They became an act that changed the perception of America on the international stage. Perhaps for the first time since 1945, an ally began to view the US not as a guarantor of stability, but as a source of threat. And the Gordie Howe Bridge, built as a symbol of unity, stood as a silent monument to a shattered faith.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures by U.S. trade partners.
Fictitious reports, allegedly published in closed think tanks in Ottawa, said that Canada was considering the possibility of gradually isolating the American economy through new trade alliances. Of course, officials never confirmed this, but the very idea that Canada was willing to discuss a scenario without the US would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. Now it sounded quite realistic. This explains the heated emotions that accompanied the opening of the bridge in September 2025. When Mark Carney cut the ribbon, he said in his speech, "This is not just a bridge. It is a line of hope." For Canadians, it meant independence. For Americans, it was a reminder of defeat. Statistics released later confirmed that instead of 10,000 cars a day, only about 6,700 were crossing the bridge. Each missing truck was like a stroke in a painting depicting the fall of the once unshakable American leadership.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
Thus, a story that began with a single tweet became a symbol of a destroyed system of trust. America lost not just money and jobs, it lost face. Canada, however, paid the price and gained new political capital by showing the world that even the most powerful slogan can be countered with a well-thought-out strategy. When the first effects of the tariffs began to be felt, it seemed that Canada was about to buckle under the weight of American pressure. But instead of responding symmetrically or waiting for allies, Mark Carney did what no one in Washington expected. He built a strategy that not only blocked the damage but also turned the crisis into a lever for national renewal. The Canadian response was unlike the usual diplomatic démarches. It was a surgical economic attack, cold and calculated, like a series of strikes on the vulnerable points of American industry. The first step was to introduce a dynamic trade response system. Previously, such measures required lengthy discussions in Parliament, approvals, and waiting for bureaucratic procedures. Now the process was automated. As soon as Washington announced a new step, an algorithm was triggered in Ottawa. Tariffs, restrictions, and countermeasures came into force, literally within hours. Newspapers called it mechanical retaliation. Even large corporations, accustomed to preparing in advance for possible risks, were caught off guard. In the first weeks after the system was introduced, more than 40 American companies lost contracts because they did not have time to adapt to the new conditions. There was talk in the corridors of Congress that Canada was using the economic weapon of the future.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
This was followed by the BETCO program, a $10 billion Canadian fund officially declared as temporary support for producers. In reality, it was a mechanism for reorienting entire industries. Companies receiving funding had to sign a commitment to reduce purchases in the US. In fact, this became a kind of economic oath: take the money and forget about suppliers from Detroit or Ohio. For many manufacturers, this was a painful decision, but the alternative was even worse: closure. By the summer of 2025, about 200 Canadian companies had switched to steel and components produced in-house or by Asian partners, completely abandoning American channels. One of the most notable moments was the story of the steel mill in Hamilton. The plant, which 5 years ago was operating at half capacity and preparing for layoffs, suddenly received millions in subsidies in exchange for completely abandoning American suppliers. 3 months later, the plant reached record volumes and announced the recruitment of 1,000 new employees. Canadian television channels showed footage of smiling workers, while entire industrial areas in the suburbs of Detroit lay empty. The contrast was striking and painful for Washington. But the most sophisticated tool was the so-called MEL-cost rules requirements to disclose detailed information about raw material sources and production processes. Officially, they were explained by the need for transparency and quality control. Unofficially, it was a way to force American companies to reveal their technological chains. Each report effectively became a map of the industrial DNA of the United States. Large corporations sounded the alarm. One of the leaks concerned the composition of alloys for the aviation industry, and analysts claimed that this information could now be used as a competitive advantage for Canada and its partners. While Washington complained about the unfairness, much more significant changes were taking place in Canada itself. Carney understood that the initiative could only be maintained through a new economy. This led to the Green Hydrogen Corridor project, a grand infrastructure program stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. In reality, it was a network of pipelines, hydrogen production plants, and energy storage stations that was supposed to turn Canada into one of the world leaders in clean energy. At every stage, construction was accompanied by a demonstration of political independence. Steel was purchased exclusively from Canadian companies. Labor was drawn from local communities, and financing came through national banks, bypassing American institutions.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
For ordinary people, this meant new jobs and a sense of involvement in the economic war. In Newfoundland, fishermen who had lost their market due to tariff battles retrained as assemblers. In Alberta, oil workers moved into the field of hydrogen technology. According to government estimates, the project created about 60,000 new jobs in its first year. Even if some of these figures were inflated for propaganda purposes, public sentiment changed dramatically. For the first time in decades, Canada felt like an independent power rather than a junior partner. At the same time, the hidden diplomatic machine was set in motion. Canada actively concluded supply agreements with Europe and Asia, emphasizing that it was now ready to become an alternative to the US in key sectors. The case of Canadian hydrogen supplies to Germany was particularly high profile. Against the backdrop of the energy crisis, Berlin signed an agreement worth tens of billions of euros, and the press made no secret of the fact that the deal was made possible largely due to American mistakes. Where the US closes doors, Canada opens new ones, is how one German minister described the situation. Washington tried to respond, but the louder the accusations of unfairness sounded, the more calm Carney appeared. He did not organize rallies, write emotional posts, or make harsh statements. Instead, dry press releases, figures, and reports on employment growth appeared on the screens. In contrast to the emotional chaos in the White House, the Canadian line seemed cold and strategically calibrated. By mid-2025, the consequences had become irreversible. Metallurgy, mechanical engineering, and energy were reviving in Canada. Even industries such as shipbuilding, which had long been considered lost, began to receive new orders thanks to domestic subsidies and international contracts. Shipyards in Vancouver saw the revival of workshops that had been idle for decades. At the same time, small businesses in the border states of the US were declaring bankruptcy en masse. According to independent researchers, 15 foundries closed in Wayne County, Michigan, alone over the summer. Canadian society perceived what was happening as a new page in national history. Newspapers wrote about the rebirth of Canada. Lessons on economic independence began to appear in schools. Television broadcast documentaries about how the country had freed itself from the American shadow. Even the national anthem was temporarily reinterpreted at mass events, where the emphasis was placed on the words about freedom and the strength of the people. For Washington, this was a blow not only to the economy but also to its symbolism. Canada no longer saw itself as a junior partner,